Where did it begin?
What is camo to me? What is camo?
Oh, we're talking about camo?
It became like this whole like street fashion, counterculture, just uniform.
When I put it on, I'm like, all right, boom, I'm gonna go hit the streets and do what I gotta do.
When you wore that kind of stuff, people like knew, like, oh, this dude listens to hip hop, he's wearing camo.
The history of it is probably one that's hidden in itself.
It has no origin. It's always been and it always will be.
Nah, camo's forever.
Camo's definitely forever.
Camouflage is nothing new. It's as old as nature. In fact, nearly everything in nature uses some form of camouflage to conceal it from its enemies.
I'm Tim O'Neill. I've been working in camouflage now for about 45 years. Camouflage began as soon as organisms on this planet developed a visual system. And it developed for a very good reason. If you can be seen, you can be eaten. And everything involved increasing the probability that an organism was going to live long enough to reproduce.
I'm Roy Behrens, and I'm a professor, and I'm also a writer and a graphic designer. I mean, you just have to wonder, when is reality genuine and when isn't it? Where did it begin? You would never be able to determine that. And if you did trace it back further, then of course you can trace it back to animal camouflage. It has no origin. It's always been and it always will be.
Now, the first scientific studies of camouflage were done at the turn of the last century, before World War I, mostly by Gerald and Abbott Thayer, who were naturalists.
I think that Abbott Thayer was able to do what he did with regard to camouflage because he had been trained as an artist. And so when he went to the French Academy to study painting, at some point he made a discovery which made him famous among naturalists and zoologists, and that is that he decoded the reason why a lot of animals have light underbellies.
The deer that run around my yard here are light underneath and darker on top. This helps kill the shadow.
What was happening is that the counter-shading coloration of the animal was counteracting the overhead light of the sun. And as a result, if you walk out into the woods and there's a deer standing there, what's the first thing they do? They freeze. And he thought the combination of freezing and the flattening effect enabled by counter shading, that was a really quite wonderful concealment device that was really very common throughout nature.
Here's another example of concealment by blending. Notice that the bird in the foreground matches the background pattern so perfectly that her presence is given away only by her shadow.
Early on, in the middle of the 18th century, accurate rifles started to appear. At that point, sharpshooter regiments started to be formed. Most frequently, they wore green uniforms because it gave you a little bit of camouflage. All of this changed when rapid-fire rifles became available, mostly later on in the Civil War in our country. At that point, casualties started to shoot up. So things changed shortly after that and began to go away from the old firing line drill to more dispersed combat procedures. And by World War I, they began to shift to less conspicuous uniforms.
I think in World War I, camouflage began with infantry camouflage. So it was a matter initially of trying to conceal soldiers on the ground. So one of the things that people thought was that, oh, they should perhaps wear uniforms that would make them blend. That was the origin apparently of khaki, which started in environments that were sand colored. And then also that there was another factor, and that was not necessarily blending with the background, but actually breaking up the figure. And that became known as disruptive camouflage.
World War I was unique in that you could be spotted in any number of ways. About this time, the submarine also became a major force in warfare. Large vessels were extremely vulnerable to being torpedoed. Look at it this way. To sink an enemy ship with a torpedo, you had to have several pieces of information. Some of that information is guesswork. You had to guess from a brief periscope image what the enemy's heading was and how fast he was going.
The British came up with an idea, and the idea was that they would not try to make their ships invisible. So what could you do? Well, they used something called Dazzle painting, and that was like the application of optical illusions, abstract constructive perspective illusions that were applied to the surface of the ship, and it seemed to work pretty well.
There are a lot of competing objectives at work here, but that's how camouflage pretty much has developed over the last century. The big break came really in the 60s when there were a series of Nobel Prizes in medicine that gave us a much better insight into how the visual system works. I would like to say that camouflage design has been dominated by science since then, but it's not always the case. We still have intuitive, fashion-based judgments being made. There's science, and then there's what the Marines call CDI factor, which is chicks dig it.
I think that's always been one of my fascinations with camouflage, because it isn't one thing. There are so many other aspects of it.
When you're trying to stand out, then you're definitely like making a statement when you wear camouflage. Like, I'm not part of the 9 to 5, I'm not part of the matrix.
I get a lot of correspondence from people who work with fashion design.
It became like this whole like street fashion, counterculture, just uniform.
People who are interested in military uniforms.
You can't see what you can't hit.
Visual artists, and people who are designers, graphic designers, and architects.
When I put it on, I'm like, all right, boom, I'm gonna go hit the streets and do what I gotta do.
At the end of the day, you know, certain clothes make you feel a certain type of way, so.
And if you go back to the history of the development of modern camouflage, you inevitably find that yes, throughout that entire history, all of those people were interested in and to some extent involved in the development of this thing called camouflage.
My name is Trina Mary. I'm a fine art body painter that lives in New York, and I specialize in camouflage body paint. Power and freedom are like definitely something that you can see or feel, I think, in a lot of the works that I do. So it varies by series, but a lot of the intent of my work is to remind ourselves of the person that is invisible. It's super strange because if you just saw a person on the street, it's really easy to ignore them. And if you put body paint on them, suddenly everybody's paying attention to them, even though I'm making the person disappear.